The snow had been falling for hours that night, piling against the glass doors of the lobby in a way that muffled every sound outside. It was close to midnight when I saw him. He didn't ring the bell or call out. He just stood there in the glow of the porch light, his coat covered in frost, his breath fogging against the glass. The roads had been empty for days, and we hadn't had a guest all week. Still there he was silent, waiting as if he had been standing there long before I noticed him. Let me know where you're listening from tonight, and if you've ever felt uneasy in a place that should have been safe. And if these late-night stories keep you company, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. My name is Dana Ellis. Back then, I was 37 and working the desk at a small mountain lodge in central Colorado. It wasn't much more than a handful of rooms, a dining hall, and a lobby with a wood stove that never seemed to stay lit. My coworker on those long winter nights was Len Turner, the maintenance man, who liked to read old Western paperbacks when nothing needed fixing. I had been at the lodge almost 5 years, filling the kind of role that was more about presence than constant work. The winters could be harsh, but I'd grown used to the rhythm of silence snowdrifts and the occasional stranded motorist looking for a bed. That particular night in January, the storm had cut off most of the county roads. The radio was full of warnings about whiteouts and black ice. By 9 o'clock, I'd written the day's logs stacked kindling by the stove and was ready to settle into the long, quiet stretch before dawn. But when I glanced up from the front desk, I saw the man outside. He didn't move until I unlocked the door. Even then, he paused on the threshold as though weighing whether to enter at all. When he finally stepped inside, he didn't shake off the snow or ask about a room. He just looked at me with pale, unreadable eyes and slid a stack of bills across the counter. No card, no name, no conversation. His voice, when it finally came, was almost too soft to hear. One night, he said, that was it. I tried to keep things professional, though I felt the weight of his silence pressing on me. I signed him into the ledger as unknown and handed over a brass key with the tag for room 4. Len wandered in from the back hall just as the man was heading up the staircase. He watched him climb the steps without a word, then turned to me with his eyebrows raised. "Don't get many like that," Len muttered. "We didn't." Most travelers who stopped with us were talkative, grateful to find warmth and shelter. This one carried no luggage, wore a coat several sizes too large, and moved like someone rehearsing each step. I tried to focus on paperwork, but I found myself glancing toward the stairwell every few minutes expecting to hear footsteps. None came. By midnight, the storm had deepened. The wind pushed against the old windows hard enough to rattle the frames. Len stoked the fire and went to check the generator shed. I poured myself weak coffee from the pot in the lobby, listening to the hollow quiet. That was when I noticed something odd. Room 4's key was back on the counter. I know I had given it to the man I remembered watching his hand take it, yet there it sat resting on the ledger, cold and damp, as though it had just been set down. I stood there staring, wondering if I had somehow made a mistake. But the guest room doors upstairs all had deadbolts that required those keys to lock from the inside. If his key was here, how had he secured the room? The register book was open beneath it, my neat handwriting marking unknown. No other name, no explanation. Len came back in stamping snow from his boots. I showed him the key, and he frowned. "Maybe you set out a spare," he said. though I knew I hadn't. We went upstairs together, the hallway dim under low-watt bulbs that buzzed faintly in their fixtures. Room 4's door was closed. I knocked, no answer. I knocked again, harder, still nothing. Len pulled out the master key, and we opened the door. The room was tidy, bed still made, heater humming softly. No footprints in the carpet, no wet patches where snow might have melted off boots. The window was shut tight, frost creeping along the edges of the glass. It looked exactly the way I had left it earlier in the day, untouched. We checked the other rooms just in case, all empty. We even walked the halls twice, calling out, but the only sound was the wind outside and the creak of the old beams. Finally, Len shrugged. "Maybe he left," he said, though neither of us had heard the front door open or seen headlights on the road. I sat awake the rest of the night, the key lying on the counter beside me. Every so often I thought I heard movement, the faint groan of a floorboard above a muffled step in the hall. Each time I would look up toward the staircase, waiting for someone to appear. No one ever did. At dawn, I went up to room 4 one last time. The door was locked from the inside. That was impossible. I had the key. Still, the bolt was drawn. When Len forced it open, the room was empty again. Sunlight spilling through the frosted window. On the desk by the lamp sat a folded slip of paper. The handwriting was small and careful. It said only, "Thank you for the room." We never saw the man again. His footprints outside had already vanished under the snow. But sometimes when the wind howled against the lodge in the small hours of the night, I'd hear faint steps on the hallway floorboards, as though room 4 still had someone in it, quietly moving, quietly waiting. I don't usually talk about this. It was the kind of night that doesn't sound frightening when you explain it, but when you live through it, the details stay with you in ways you can't shake. I was 41 then, managing the graveyard shift at a warehouse on the edge of Allentown, Pennsylvania. The place stored mostly building supplies, pallets of drywall lumber insulation, and rows of steel shelving that stretched higher than a man could reach. Nights were usually quiet, a handful of workers on forklifts moving loads, the hum of the conveyor system, and the low thud of doors closing in the distance. That fall, the company had hired a young guy named Wesley. He couldn't have been more than 20, wiry and restless, the type who checked his phone every chance he got. He didn't know the routines yet, so I kept him nearby during his first weeks, showing him where things were and making sure he didn't get lost among the aisles. One Tuesday night in October, a storm rolled through, the kind that shakes the walls and makes the loading dock doors rattle against their tracks. Most of the crew clocked out early because shipments had been delayed by the weather. By 11, it was just me and Wesley left to lock up. The rain on the roof had that hollow metallic rhythm, and the security lights flickered with every gust of wind. I was finishing the end-of-shift logs in the small office at the front when I noticed Wesley wasn't where I'd left him. He'd been stacking boxes near the northeast corner. I figured he'd gone for a smoke, but after 10 minutes I went to check. The warehouse was huge, a football field of shadows and echoing space, and it was easy for sound to play tricks. Still, I could swear I heard someone speaking when I walked down the main aisle. Not loud, not clear, but like a low voice drifting from somewhere in the racks. When I rounded the corner, Wesley was standing by a stack of pallets frozen. He didn't see me at first. He was staring into the darkness between two rows, listening intently like someone was whispering just out of sight. I called his name and he jumped, turning with this wide-eyed look I didn't recognize. I asked who he was talking to. He shook his head quickly and muttered that it was nothing, just the wind, but he looked pale, sweat clinging to his forehead despite the chill. We went back to work, but the atmosphere shifted after that. Every time the lights buzzed overhead, Wesley would glance up nervously. Every metallic creak from the shelving made him flinch. I tried to brush it off as nerves it was. His first month working nights, and the warehouse could feel oppressive when it emptied out. By 1 in the morning, I was ready to lock up. I did my usual walkthrough, checking that doors were secure and equipment powered down. Wesley tagged along, but he kept glancing behind us like he expected someone to be following. When we passed the break room, he stopped cold. On the table sat a folded piece of paper that hadn't been there earlier. The room had been empty all night, and I was the only one with a key. I unfolded it. There was no message, just a name written neatly in black ink. Wesley. Nothing else. The handwriting wasn't mine, and it didn't match anyone on the crew. Wesley went rigid, insisting he hadn't left it. He backed out of the room like he couldn't stand to be near it. I tried to steady him, telling him it was probably someone's idea of a prank. But I'll admit, even I felt uneasy. The warehouse doors had been locked since 10. No one could have slipped in. I put the note in my pocket and told him we'd review the cameras in the morning. As we walked toward the exit, we passed one of the far aisles. That's when I noticed something that still bothers me. The red exit sign at the end of the corridor was glowing, but there was a shadow across it. Not the shape of shelving or boxes. This was rounded, human-sized, standing perfectly still. I blinked and it was gone, just the empty aisle again. Wesley saw it too. He muttered, "That's him," under his breath, then hurried ahead of me. I didn't press him on what he meant. The storm outside was pounding hard enough to shake the walls, and I just wanted to get him out the door. We left the building locked up, and I drove home uneasy. The note with his name stayed in my jacket pocket all night. I ended up sleeping poorly, listening to the storm batter the siding of my house. The next evening, Wesley didn't show up for his shift. No call, no text, just gone. I tried reaching his number, but it went straight to voicemail. By the third day, I contacted Officer Brewster, a local cop who occasionally checked on the property. He said Wesley's parents had filed a missing person report that morning. He'd left his phone on his nightstand, his bed unmade, and his car in the driveway. When Brewster asked if anything unusual had happened at work, I hesitated. Eventually, I showed him the folded note. He studied it quietly, then slipped it into an evidence bag. "We'll keep in touch," he said. But his expression suggested he already knew this case wouldn't resolve cleanly. Weeks passed. The police never found Wesley. His parents stopped by the warehouse once, asking if I'd seen or heard anything else. I couldn't tell them the truth that sometimes on stormy nights when the warehouse is almost empty, I still hear that same low murmur between the aisles. Always faint, always just out of reach. And once, when I stayed late to check an inventory glitch, I found another folded slip of paper on the break room table. Same ink, same hand. But this time it didn't say Wesley, it said Mark. I grew up near the ocean, so I've never found the beach frightening. But one weekend in 2022, staying alone in a small rental house on the South Carolina coast, I learned how quickly comfort can twist into unease. At the time, I was 29, working freelance design jobs from my laptop, trying to escape the grind of long hours in Charlotte. A friend had recommended an old beachfront property that rented cheap through one of the short-term rental sites. It wasn't much, 2 bedrooms, faded curtains, and weathered siding that had probably stood through decades of storms, but it was right on the water, and for a while I thought that was enough. The host was a woman named Ruth, well into her 70s, who lived in town. She'd met me at the front door with a set of brass keys and a handwritten note full of instructions. Her voice was warm, but there was something brisk in the way she moved, as though she wanted me settled quickly so she could leave. She reminded me to lock both doors at night, one to the front porch and one to the side patio, then handed me a slip of paper with her number written 3 times. "In case the phone goes out," she said. I thought it was a strange comment, but I smiled and promised I'd call if I needed anything. That first night was peaceful. The tide was high, the surf constant, and the house creaked in the wind the way old coastal homes do. I left the windows cracked for air and fell asleep, listening to the steady rhythm of water on sand. But around 2 in the morning, something woke me. At first, I thought it was the refrigerator cycling on, until I realized the sound was coming from outside the window. It was a low whistle, rising and falling slowly, not quite a tune, but close. I sat up, heart pushing against my ribs, straining to listen. The whistle went on for maybe 20 seconds, then stopped. I convinced myself it was someone walking home from the bars, taking the beach path by mistake, and eventually I drifted back to sleep. The next morning I walked down to the gas station for coffee. The clerk was a man about my age who asked if I was staying in Ruth's place. When I said yes, his eyes flicked toward the windows, like he didn't want to meet mine. "Lock your doors at night," he said, handing back my change. His voice was low, almost like he didn't want anyone else to hear. By the second night, the weather had turned humid. The house felt heavy, full of damp air that clung to my skin. I shut the windows and left the ceiling fan on low. At around the same time as before, a little after 2, the whistle returned. This time, closer, almost against the side wall of the house. I lay there motionless, listening, as it trailed off, followed by the faint crunch of footsteps moving away over sand and broken shells. I stayed awake until dawn, every shadow in the room shifting as though someone were moving just out of sight. When Miss Ruth stopped by that afternoon to collect a package from the porch, I mentioned it casually, trying to keep my voice light. She froze, her hand resting on the box, then said, "Don't leave the curtains open after dark. Nothing more." She walked back to her car without another word. By the third night, I felt trapped between wanting to pack up and leave, and the embarrassment of admitting I was frightened of nothing more than sounds outside. I double-locked both doors, shut every curtain, and kept my phone on the nightstand. Just after 2, the sound came again, not a whistle this time, but the distinct click of the back door handle being tested. The knob rattled once, then stopped as if whoever was there realized it wouldn't turn. I grabbed my phone and stood in the hallway, every nerve in my body screaming to move quietly. From where I stood, I could see the faint glow of the porch light through the curtain. A shape passed in front of it, tall enough that the light cut off for a second before returning. Then the sound of slow steps on the wooden boards faded toward the beach. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the armchair until daylight, the brass keys clenched in my hand. When I checked the back patio in the morning, there were fresh prints in the sand. Not shoes exactly, but bare feet. Long strides each step pressed deep into the damp ground. I drove into town more shaken than I wanted to admit and told the gas station clerk what had happened. He nodded like he'd been waiting for me to say it. "You're not the first," he said quietly, "but you should be the last. Don't spend another night there." I left that afternoon, packed my things, locked the doors behind me, and dropped the keys at Miss Ruth's house. She didn't answer the bell, but when I turned to go, I saw the curtain in her front window shift slightly, like she was standing just behind it, watching. To this day, I don't know who was outside that house at night or why they came back at the same time, always just after 2. All I know is that when I hear a low whistle now, no matter where I am, I feel the same cold pressure in my chest I felt on that damp, lonely stretch of beach. I don't usually tell people about the last night I ever spent at the county fair. It sounds like the kind of memory you invent, the kind that grows strange in your mind over time. But I was 18 in 2007, and I remember the details too clearly for it to have been anything but real. That year, the fairgrounds outside Wichita were busier than I'd ever seen them. The rides rattled against their steel frames, the lights flickered in the dusk air, and every path smelled like sugar hay and gasoline. My 2 friends, Charlie and Denny, and I had gone mostly to chase girls and eat corn dogs, but by the end of the night, I would have given anything just to go home. The 3 of us were standing near the midway when Charlie spotted a small photo booth tucked between the balloon dart game and a funnel cake stand. It was old, the kind with a faded curtain and a dim orange light glowing from within. A girl about our age sat inside, looking out through the opening like she was waiting for someone. She smiled when she saw us, and before I could say anything, Charlie ducked through the curtain and sat beside her. Denny followed laughing. I stood back uncomfortable as the machine began to whir and flash. When they came out, Charlie was grinning like an idiot, and Denny kept shaking his head. They showed me the strip of photos. In every frame, the girl was sitting between them, her expression flat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. But when I looked closer, I noticed something that froze me. The girl wasn't looking at the camera in any of the shots. She was staring straight at me, eyes wide, mouth just slightly open. I tried to laugh it off, but the unease stuck with me. When I glanced back at the booth, she was still inside, curtain half closed, watching us. Charlie wanted to go back in, but I insisted we keep moving. We wandered toward the rides, but no matter where we went, I kept catching glimpses of her pale face in the crowd. Sometimes by the ticket booth, sometimes near the livestock pens, always just far enough away that I couldn't be sure it was really her. Around 10, we decided to call it a night. Denny's mom was waiting in the parking lot. As we crossed the fairgrounds, Charlie patted his pocket and said he'd lost the photo strip. We retraced our steps, and that's when we saw it. The booth curtain closed machine, humming faintly. A new strip of photos dangled from the slot. Charlie reached down and pulled it free. This time, the pictures showed all 3 of us standing outside the booth. In the background of each shot, the girl was visible, slipping closer, frame by frame. Until in the last photo, she was directly behind me, her hand raised like she was about to touch my shoulder. We didn't say anything after that. We just left, silent, until we reached the car. I couldn't shake the feeling of her breath on my neck, though I knew she had never been that close. A week later, county police came to the school. Officer Delgado pulled us aside and asked questions about that night, whether we'd spoken to a girl at the fair. He wouldn't tell us much, only that someone matching her description had been reported missing 2 days earlier. When I asked if they'd found her, he gave a slow shake of his head. I never went back to the fair. I don't even like looking at those strips of black and white photo booth pictures you sometimes see taped to dorm walls or tucked in the corners of mirrors. I keep thinking about her eyes in that last frame fixed on me, as though she already knew where I'd be standing. To this day, I don't know if the camera had been broken or if it had shown us something that was never supposed to be captured at all. The last steady job I worked before I left Colorado was at a gas station off Highway 285. It wasn't the kind of place where much happened. Nights were long, and I mostly kept myself busy mopping the floors, refilling the coffee pots, and watching the lights of the semis as they drifted past on the highway. Still, there's one stretch of nights I can't shake from my memory. And even now, years later, I sometimes wake at the exact same time and feel that old knot of dread tighten in my chest. It started with a man in a blue hoodie. He came in just after 3 in the morning, bought exactly $12 of gas, and left without a word. That in itself wasn't unusual, but when he came back the next night at the exact same time, I took notice. Same hoodie, same walk, same $12. Third night, same thing again. By the 4th night, I was waiting for him before the door even chimed. He didn't glance at me, didn't grab snacks or coffee like most travelers did. Just $12 of gas, paid in cash, then gone. After a week, I mentioned it on the radio to dispatch more as a joke than anything else. Got myself a creature of habit out here, I said. Man loves his $12 of gas at 3:17 a.m. on the dot. The dispatcher chuckled and told me maybe the guy was superstitious. But by the 10th night, when the routine hadn't broken, once I started writing the exact times on the log sheet just to prove to myself it was happening the way I remembered. It wasn't just the timing that bothered me. Each time he drove up in a different car, sometimes an old pickup, sometimes a newer sedan. Once, even a rental with temporary tags still taped inside the window. But the man himself never changed. Always the blue hoodie, always the hood pulled up just enough to shadow his face. By the 12th night, curiosity got the better of me. I stepped out from behind the counter as he paid, asked if he wanted a receipt, tried to make eye contact. He didn't answer, didn't even nod. He set the bills on the counter with a precise motion, turned, and walked out as though I wasn't there. I watched through the window as he pumped the gas. The station's canopy lights reflected off the hood of the car, but his face stayed hidden, no matter how I tried to angle my view. Then came the night the pattern broke. I remember staring at the clock as the minutes ticked past 3:15, then 3:20, then 3:30. My relief should have been immediate, but instead I felt something tighten inside me. At 3:47, headlights finally pulled into the lot. It was him, same hoodie, same steady steps. But this time he didn't head for the counter. He walked straight to the glass door and stood there, hands at his sides, staring in through the reflection. I can't tell you exactly how long I stayed frozen behind the counter. Long enough to realize the door chime hadn't gone off, long enough to realize he hadn't touched the handle. He was just standing there, not moving, as if waiting for me to step outside. When he finally turned away, I picked up the phone and called dispatch, my voice shaking worse than I'd expected. The regional trooper on duty promised to swing by, but by the time the cruiser's lights swept across the lot, the man was gone. The officer asked questions, but I could tell by his expression that he thought I'd exaggerated. Probably just a drifter, he said, someone playing games. I didn't see him the next night, or the one after that. Then, 3 nights later, he came back not at 3:17, but at 2:59. Same hoodie, same motionless stance at the door. Only this time he raised one hand, palm flat against the glass, like he was marking the moment. That was the last night I worked there. I finished my shift, handed in my keys the next morning, and drove out before sundown. The new guy who took over lasted less than 2 weeks before quitting without notice. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd opened the door, if I'd stepped outside when he was waiting. I don't think he ever wanted the gas. I think the gas was just his excuse to arrive on time night after night until I was ready to follow. And I'll tell you this much, I never look at the clock between 3 and 4 in the morning anymore. Because if I do, I'm always afraid I'll see headlights pulling in right on schedule. Back in 2014, I took a road trip with 3 friends that still doesn't make sense to me, no matter how often I try to explain it. We weren't kids anymore, but we weren't quite grown either, and the drive was supposed to be one of those trips you look back on years later as the turning point where everyone drifted into adulthood. Instead, it's the kind of story I only tell when I'm sure nobody will laugh, because the details don't sound possible when you string them together. There were 4 of us, packed into an old Chevy sedan. Drew was behind the wheel most of the time, with Kyle and Marcus trading off when his eyelids got too heavy. I usually sat in the back with a map balanced on my knees, pointing out detours that took us through places I thought might be interesting. That's how we ended up on the south edge of Tulsa late one night in a part of the city that looked more like an abandoned factory yard than anywhere you'd want to stop for gas. The air smelled like rust and wet concrete, the kind of heavy industrial dampness that never really fades. Streetlights flickered in half-dead intervals, and rows of warehouses stood silent, their windows blacked out with grime. We hadn't seen another car for miles. When Drew suggested pulling over to check the map again, the 3 of us agreed, if only because the monotony was starting to wear thin. We found a little diner tucked between 2 freight yards, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't changed its sign or curtains in 40 years. The neon buzzed overhead, casting a sickly blue glow over the parking lot. Inside the booths were cracked vinyl, the tile floor sticky under our shoes, and a lone waitress leaned on the counter like she hadn't seen a customer all week. She gave us a smile, but her eyes stayed on us in a way that made me uncomfortable. We ordered coffee and fries, spread out the road atlas, and started bickering about the fastest way west. That's when the waitress came back, and without being asked, set a folded napkin on the table beside me. At first, I thought she'd written down a total, but when I opened it all it said was, "You're almost out west. I showed it to the others, expecting them to laugh, but instead the table went quiet. Marcus frowned and asked if it was some kind of joke. The waitress didn't answer. She just topped off our cups and walked away. The silence between us stretched on longer than it should have. Something about the words felt wrong, like they weren't meant as encouragement, but as a warning we didn't understand. Drew pushed the napkin aside and told us to forget it. We left a few dollars on the table and headed back out into the night. That's when things started to feel different. The air outside was colder, sharper somehow, and the lot that had been empty when we arrived now held two other vehicles. Dark vans parked nose to nose with their lights off. No one was visible inside, but we all felt watched as we climbed back into the Chevy. We pulled out onto the road, but almost immediately, Marcus started acting strange. He leaned forward from the back seat, insisting we should turn right, when the map clearly showed left was the way to the highway. His voice had a sharpness I'd never heard before, almost angry, as though he knew something the rest of us didn't. When Drew ignored him and kept driving straight, Marcus slammed his fist against the window hard enough to rattle the glass. We told ourselves he was tired, that maybe the coffee had hit him wrong, but by the time we reached the next intersection, Kyle was arguing too. He swore we'd already passed this stretch of warehouses that we'd been looping without realizing it. He made Drew pull over, insisting we check the map again. That was when I noticed something that still chills me. The napkin from the diner was sitting on my lap, again perfectly folded, though I was sure I'd left it on the table. The road signs didn't make sense anymore. We circled back toward the freeway, only to end up in the same industrial yard we'd started from. The vans were still there, parked in the same position, and I thought I saw a shadow shift inside one of them. My stomach turned cold. One by one, my friends stopped feeling like themselves. Drew's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and his breathing came shallow and quick, like he was afraid to admit he was lost. Marcus wouldn't stop muttering under his breath, and Kyle just stared out the window with a blankness I'd never seen before. I tried to keep everyone calm, but I could feel something pressing against us, the way a room feels heavier when someone unwelcome enters. At some point, we must have turned down the wrong street, because the next thing I remember is an open lot surrounded by chain-link fence. The headlights caught a wall of freight containers, stacked 3 high red paint peeling under the rust. I blinked and the lot was empty. When I looked again, Drew was gone, just gone from behind the wheel, though the car never stopped moving. Marcus climbed into the front seat without a word, his face unreadable. Kyle told me to stop looking at the napkin, but when I glanced down, it wasn't blank anymore. A new line had been scrawled beneath the first, the ink still wet. You're almost out west. 2 left. The rest of the night is broken into pieces in my memory, scattered like glass I can't fit back together. I remember headlights flashing from behind us, then nothing in the mirrors. I remember Kyle opening his door while the car was still moving and stepping out onto the blacktop without looking back. And I remember the sound of Marcus's laughter fading as he walked into the dark, leaving me alone with the wheel. By the time dawn broke, I was parked on the shoulder of the interstate engine, still running, hands locked tight around the steering wheel. The lot, the vans, the warehouses, all of it was gone. The only thing in the car with me was the napkin resting neatly on the passenger seat, with a final line written in the same cramped hand. You're the last one. I never saw Drew Kyle or Marcus again. No reports were filed. No trace of them came up in the weeks that followed. I don't talk about it often because people assume there must be more to the story. But I know what I saw, and I know what followed us out of that diner. Even now, every time I head west on the highway, I check the dashboard clock without meaning to. And when the minute hand creeps toward 3 in the morning, I find myself bracing for a folded napkin to appear in my lap again. I don't usually mention this when I talk about the years I spent traveling for work, because it sounds more like a dream than something that happened. Back in 2011, I spent a lot of time on the road, driving from one small town to another to handle insurance assessments. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. One trip in particular has stayed with me, though not for anything I could ever put in a report. It was February, cold enough that the Mississippi River looked more like a sheet of gray steel than water, and I was passing through Hannibal, Missouri. The town had that layered quiet of old river cities, where brick buildings lean into one another and streets empty after sundown. My hotel was across from a funeral home, a squat limestone building with narrow windows and a rusted metal sign that looked older than the place itself. That evening I saw lights on inside and decided to step in. I wasn't attending a service, but I had a professional excuse. I needed to check some documents related to flood coverage, and the funeral director, a man named Mr. Greaves, was supposed to be there. The entryway smelled faintly of flowers and furniture polish, and a young woman at a folding table asked me to sign the guest book. I told her I wasn't staying, just meeting someone briefly, and she nodded without a word. Inside the viewing room, the service had already ended. The flowers stood in drooping arrangements, the casket was closed, and the chairs were mostly empty. Mr. Greaves was stacking programs near the front, his motions slow and deliberate, as though every movement was a habit more than a choice. I spoke with him for a few minutes, got the documents I needed, and was about to leave when I noticed something that made me pause. A man walked out of the chapel's side door. He wasn't dressed like a mourner, not in black or gray, but in a plain brown jacket and dark slacks. His head was lowered, his pace steady as though he'd been sitting among the empty chairs for some time. I thought maybe he was family or staff someone I hadn't noticed before. But when I glanced back at Mr. Greaves, he was staring at the door with a stillness that unsettled me. The hallway outside was quiet except for the faint hum of the building's furnace. I expected to hear the man's footsteps on the tile, but there was nothing. When I stepped into the hall a moment later, it was empty. The doors at both ends were closed, the carpet unmarked, and the air felt oddly chilled, as if someone had just left. I tried to shake it off, but as I passed the folding table on my way out, the young woman slid the guest book toward me again. This time, I caught a glimpse of the page she had opened. The last entry wasn't mine, and it hadn't been there when I first walked in. The handwriting was sharp, almost mechanical, spelling out a name I didn't recognize, followed by the time, 9:17 p.m. That was the exact moment I had seen the man walk out of the chapel. I didn't sign, and she didn't ask again. I just left the night air biting at my face as I crossed back to the hotel. From my room window, I could see the funeral home's dark shape against the streetlights. For a long time, I kept expecting the side door to open and that same figure to step out, but it never did. I filed my papers the next morning and drove on, but even now I sometimes wonder who or what needed to leave a name in that book. That was the last story I'll share tonight. Thinking back on all of these memories, I'm struck by how ordinary the settings were. None of them were places anyone would call remarkable. Motels, diners, warehouses, funeral homes, just the kind of places you pass through and forget about. Yet it's those spaces that seem to hold on to the strangest moments, the ones that never quite leave you even years later. What unsettles me most isn't the fear itself, but the quiet persistence of it. The feeling that there are details still lingering in the corners, things we weren't meant to notice but did for just a moment. A man walking out of a locked chapel, a name written where it shouldn't be, a warning left behind in a place no one should have been. Maybe that's the real nature of these stories. They aren't about shadows or monsters, but about interruptions. The sudden reminder that our routines aren't as closed and predictable as we want them to be. And once you've seen those interruptions, you never quite go back to believing the world is orderly again. So as you lay down tonight and let the day fade, remember that the unease isn't always loud or violent. Sometimes it's just the echo of footsteps you don't remember making, or a name written where no one should have signed. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of tonight's stories. If you'd like to hear more of these late-night accounts, I hope you'll subscribe, share them with a friend, and return for the next one. Before you drift off, tell me in the comments, have you ever been in a place where something felt wrong? Not because of what you saw, but because of what you couldn't explain. Good night and sleep well.